time for that. So good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Marcia Garrett. I'm the president of the World Affairs Council of Tacoma, and we are really pleased to host this program tonight. If you're not familiar with our organization, please go to our website, wactacoma.com. You'll see a list of our upcoming programs, the books we'll be reading this year, and also ways that you can support our work, which are always appreciated. So by way of background, our speaker tonight, Tom Countryman, will be speaking for about 30 to 35 minutes, which will leave us a lot of time for Q&A at the end. I'll start with a few questions of my own to get the ball rolling, and then John Lucas, whose title says WACT Administrator, will be monitoring the chat box, and we will get to as many questions as we can. If a question occurs to you during Tom's remarks, feel free to go ahead and post it in the chat. You don't need to wait until his remarks have concluded. I'd like to note that he is Zooming to us tonight from his home in Washington, D.C., which of course is 3 hours ahead. So thank you again for your willingness to do an evening program. That was very gracious of you. He has agreed to, if there are a lot of questions, he has agreed to keep going after our 7:30 stop time. But when it is time to pull the plug, we hope that you'll respect the time difference. 3 hours means a lot at this time of night. So with that, I am really pleased to introduce Tom Countryman, who has been a great friend of the World Affairs Council. He was born and raised in Tacoma. He graduated from Bellarmine Prep, Washington University in St. Louis, and studied at Harvard. What dazzles me is that he speaks 5 languages, and they're all the easy ones: Serbo-Croatian, Arabic, German, Italian, and Greek. He's one of these classic underperformers, right? Serbo-Croatian, and well, at any rate, yeah. Tom was chosen in 2017 to serve as the head of the Arms Control Association. It's a post that he still holds. The ACA is a nonpartisan, non-governmental organization that analyzes key national security issues and then advises the executive branch, the Congress, and the public on choices that not only promote global security, but also reduce the risk that weapons of mass destruction will be used. He retired from the Foreign Service in 2017 after 35 years of service. At the time of his retirement, he had 2 portfolios. He was serving as both the acting Undersecretary for Arms Control and International Security, as well as the Assistant Secretary of International Security and Nonproliferation. The Bureau, the ISN Bureau, leads the U.S. effort to prevent the spread of nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons. He came out of retirement briefly in 2021 and returned to the State Department as a senior advisor and served as the deputy head of the US Delegation to the 2022 review conference of the Nonproliferation Treaty. You would be hard-pressed to find any single speaker who is better equipped to speak tonight on the topic of nuclear weapons than Tom Countryman. So with that, the floor is all yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Marcia, for a generous introduction. I would rather be in Tacoma than in Washington, D.C., but I seem to have put down roots here. I'll try to uproot them and join you. I hope to visit at least this year. It's great to see so many friends on the call, and some family even, and associates from Bellarmine. And a couple people from further away as well. So tonight, no slides, no pictures, just one talking head. And we'll cover quite a few topics, but primarily one in depth. And then there's lots of times for questions and answers. And I always find that for an audience like this, the questions and answers teach me something. There's no such thing as a stupid question when it comes to nuclear weapons. So feel free to prepare a good question. I wanted to talk tonight about the range of nuclear challenges that the United States and the Earth face at this time. In my opinion, there is a higher risk of a nuclear conflict today than there has been at any time in the last 60 years. It is not a measurable risk. It is not a high risk, but it is not zero. And it is noticeably different than any situation we've faced since the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. And I'll list several reasons for this, and then I'll come back and focus on one particular topic. The primary reason and the main topic for tonight are the actions of Russia, not specifically its invasion of Ukraine, but the way that it has utilized its nuclear arsenal to try, unsuccessfully so far, to gain some leverage over Ukraine, the United States, and NATO. And in particular, we'll talk about the recent decision of Mr. Putin to suspend implementation of the New START nuclear control treaty. It's a reminder that as much as you can analyze the risk of nuclear warfare and the concepts of deterrence in terms of rational states and how a rational actor would proceed on the world stage, there remains room for a single individual, a single actor to dramatically change the course of history. The other factors that I'll just mention now, and we can come back to them in Q&A, is that some of the Russian actions, not just in the last year, but over the last several years, have revived in both Moscow and Washington serious thinking about the concept of limited nuclear war, that you could fight a nuclear war without it resulting in total devastation of both opponents. It's logical to think about it. It is dangerous to plan for it, and it's dangerous to begin thinking that the concept and the planning for it are safe things to do. Third is China, which is rapidly expanding its nuclear arsenal, and the response of the United States and others could easily drag us in to a new nuclear arms race, one that would be just as dangerous, possibly more dangerous, certainly more expensive than the madness that we went through in the 1960s. There remain, of course, North Korea, and it's hard to speak rationally about what Kim Jong-un will do, but it's a genuine concern that has to be dealt with. We have to think about Iran. Iran is not a nuclear weapons possessor today, and there remains room for diplomacy to prevent Iran from ever becoming a nuclear weapon state. So those are some of the big issues that we ought to worry about, but let's focus in a little bit on Russia and how it has utilized its nuclear arsenal at seeking to gain leverage over Ukraine and over the West. I'm a little bit less concerned than I was 6 months ago that Russia might decide to use one of its quote unquote smaller nuclear weapons in the military conflict in Ukraine. There's no military gain to be had from use of such a weapon so close to your own territory and your own fighters, and there are severe political consequences for making such a decision. Yet, and it has been a tiny bit reassuring that even though Putin repeatedly mentioned the potential of nuclear warfare in connection with Ukraine as, to put it bluntly, a scare tactic, they have also made statements at high levels in Russia that recognize that there's no military gain to be had from use of such a weapon. I can't entirely exclude the possibility, because no matter how many experts you have seen speaking in the last year who say they know how Vladimir Putin thinks, it's rather obvious that nobody knows exactly what he thinks and what he is likely to do if he faces a truly desperate situation, a clear military defeat on the battlefield. So I don't dismiss the threat that Ukraine, even today, could lead to the use of a nuclear weapon by Russia. But what I want to talk about tonight is the announcement that Putin made last month about New START. To remind you, the New START treaty was negotiated in 2010 between the US and Russia. It has been in effect since 2011, and it expires as a treaty in February of 2026. It does a few important things. It sets an upper limit on the number of delivery vehicles that each side can have. Now, delivery vehicles, a bomber, a submarine, a missile, are not the same thing as a warhead, but in the peculiar way that arms control is developed between Washington and Moscow, counting delivery vehicles is a substitute for counting warheads. Both sides are limited to a total number of 1,550 strategic warheads mounted and ready for delivery on missiles, submarines, or bombers. In addition to this limitation, the two sides negotiated several hundred pages of detail on how they would verify this with each other, how they would build the kind of transparency so that each side knew the other wasn't cheating. And it means first, notifications. Every time either the US or the Russian Federation moves one of these delivery vehicles or moves a warhead under certain conditions, it notifies the other. And since 2011, the two sides have exchanged almost 25,000 notifications that provide unprecedented transparency on each other's force posture. We also do inspections, 3 each year at nuclear sites. Russian inspectors would come to the US inspectors to Russia, and verify that the numbers were identical to what was declared. And then each of us also have what is called national technical means. That means, in short, spy satellites that allow us to have some confidence that the declarations and inspections show exactly the real force posture. Now, that's the essence of the New START treaty, and it is the latest in a series of treaties and agreements between Washington and Moscow since 1972 that have brought us down from the absolutely insane level to the of 70,000 warheads between the two sides, down to the only moderately insane level of having about 6,000 warheads on each side, of which 1,550 are deployed and ready for service. So it's a significant achievement of the Obama administration. And it was Mr. Putin last month who declared that Russia would now suspend implementation of the New START treaty. Now, a couple of points about what he meant, and then I'll tell you what he really said. The first thing is it shouldn't be surprising that he finally did this. It is clear today that for Russia, there is only one item on its foreign policy agenda, and that is success in Ukraine. And it's also clear, after the pathetic performance of the Russian military, that there's only one category in which Russia could still be considered a superpower, and that is possession of nuclear weapons. So it was inevitable that it would, in its quest to succeed in Ukraine, use the last lever that it has, and the most dangerous lever. What Mr. Putin did is illegal. I know that any of you who have studied foreign relations or international law know that international law is not hard and fast, but there are some pretty basic things to it. It's illegal first because there is no provision in the treaty that allows either side to suspend implementation of the treaty. And something called the Vienna Convention, which is, you can think of it as the Treaty on Treaties, defines the circumstances under which a country could suspend or withdraw from a treaty. And none of the conditions laid out there are met in this case. It's important for world public opinion that we continue to call out the fact that Putin's move to suspend the treaty was not only dangerous, but illegal, and a further affront to the series of agreements that he has violated over the last year. Putin specifically said that there would be no notifications and no inspections. He, however, did say very clearly that he would continue to respect the central limits, that is, the upper limit of 1,550 warheads deployed on each side, and that he expects the United States to do the same. One of the things he mentioned that did not get as much prominence in the press, but that is concerning, is he did a typical Russian maneuver of accusing the US of something that he's thinking about doing, specifically testing atomic weapons. Neither the United States nor the Russian Federation has conducted an explosive test of a nuclear weapon for more than 30 years. Russia is bound by the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty that it signed and ratified. The US has signed, but sadly has not ratified that treaty. But North Korea is the only country that has done nuclear testing in the last 30 years. Putin accused the United States of planning to resume nuclear testing and threatened that Russia would respond in kind. Now, there always are people in the US government, whether politicians or scientists whose whole career has been nuclear testing, who think it's a good idea for the US to go back to nuclear testing. It's a very bad idea because if everyone starts testing again, they will catch up to the United States in terms of knowledge of nuclear weapon design and maintenance. And by the way, none of the politicians who advocate for resuming US nuclear testing are from Nevada, where the tests would be done. They're from Arkansas and Oklahoma and so on. It's not a serious prospect that the US will go back to testing, but I am concerned now that it's a serious prospect that Russia may decide, in order to scare the hell out of Europeans, to conduct a nuclear test as a form of escalation that falls short of actually using a nuclear weapon in combat. So what are the implications of the Russian decision? First, we should have been focused in the last 2 years on negotiating with Russia a successor agreement to New START, which will expire, as I said, less than 3 years from now. Without an agreement limiting weapons on both sides, the first time we would see that in 50 years, the two sides would be unrestrained to build up their nuclear arsenal as much as they want. And the problem with that is that when you lose the transparency that notifications and inspections give you, it is the job and the nature of military planners to assume the worst case, to assume that there is a greater arsenal on the other side, that there's a particular Russian policy. The Russians would assume the worst about us, and we would be locked into a nuclear arsenal structure that's based upon our worst fears of the other side rather than their actual capabilities. It was already going to be difficult enough to negotiate a successor treaty, or if not a treaty, some other form of agreement with Russia. It's now going to become even more difficult. First, in part because on the US side, everything in this city of Washington is difficult, and every sensible step that the administration is going to take will draw criticism, justified or not. Mr. Putin has given additional reason for critics of the Biden administration to complain if they make any move towards a new arms control agreement. And second, it's hard just to talk to the Russians these days. I still do every few weeks on a Zoom call like this, what we call track 2 discussions with a bunch of retired diplomats and generals from Russia and the United States and some European countries. And those are people who are no longer government officials. But the divergence in vocabulary and in basic concepts gets greater all the time. And those discussions become less and less productive. It's even worse, of course, on the government level. I had the opportunity when I was back at the State Department last summer to attend some international conferences in which Russian diplomats participated. And the concepts of reality that our two countries hold are simply diverging every more. And now when the Biden administration has done the right thing and said, we are prepared to continue the discussions about nuclear weapon restraint with Russia, regardless of what else is happening in the world, regardless of what's happening in Ukraine. That's an important statement, and it ought to be repeated publicly every day. But the Russians are not willing at this moment to engage in that dialogue. There's an old saying that has been proven true more than once in the history of arms control negotiations, that Washington and Moscow have identical positions, but never at identical times. A year ago, after the invasion, the US said, we can't continue a strategic dialogue about nuclear weapons because of Ukraine. Today, it is the Russians who say, we can't have such a dialogue because of Ukraine. So for all these reasons, we're going to have a harder time getting to a new agreement that would lower the temperature and keep us from getting into a new nuclear arms race. One thing that is worth understanding, although it is as frightening as many of the other things I've said, is that both the US and Russia, although they have 1,500 deployed strategic weapons, they each have thousands in reserve, and they each have unused capacity on bombers and submarines and missiles. And so what is some experts are seeking to measure now is what is the upload capacity. For example, if the treaty went away today, how rapidly could the US and Russia build up above the 1,550 level? And the answer is that, in fact, the US at the moment has a greater capability for immediate upload, so that within a few years, the US, instead of 1,550, could have 2,500 to 3,000 nuclear warheads deployed. The Russians have perhaps more capacity in the long run, but in the short run of 3 years, they could probably build up between 2,000 and 2,500 nuclear warheads deployed. One of the interesting things from these informal conversations with retired Russian experts is several of them say that the loss of the treaty, or even just the loss of transparency, has more dangerous effects for Russian security than for American security. The reason the upload numbers matter is because I am seriously concerned, as I said at the start, about a new nuclear arms race. Even before this latest Russian step on New START, we had voices in Washington, some for political reasons, some because of their connections to a powerful military lobby, and others out of genuine concern, genuine military experts, who said that if China is going to expand its nuclear arsenal up to 1,000 nuclear warheads in the next several years, it's important for the United States to rebuild its arsenal so that we have a total number of warheads that matches the combined total of Russia and China. And there can be some sophisticated arguments in favor of this position. Mr. Putin's actions only add fuel to that kind of thinking. And it worries me deeply because the essence of nuclear deterrence is not that you can match all of your adversaries one for nuclear weapons. The essence of deterrence is that your adversary is convinced that there will be a rapid, immediate, and devastating response to any use of nuclear weapons. We have that capability several times over with 1,500 deployed strategic weapons. Having 2,000 does not add to that capability, nor does it make us less vulnerable to the reality of rapid, devastating destruction of our homeland in case of a nuclear war. We would, to tie ourselves into not just a two-way, but a three-way nuclear arms race is a genuine prospect for the coming years, and one that I think we ought to be concerned about. So, what should the US government be doing? One of the things I learned in diplomacy is that when you have an adversary who is trying to provoke you, the most infuriating and effective thing you can do is to refuse to be provoked. It's very clear that among the objectives of Putin's announcement was to see if he could provoke the United States into withdrawing from the New START treaty. Recall that he succeeded in this twice before in the Trump administration. Trump, who never liked any treaty, withdrew from both the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty and the Open Skies Treaty in response to Russian provocations. So from Putin's point of view, it was worth a try to see if he could put the onus on the United States instead for the escalation of nuclear tension. To its credit, the Biden administration has responded calmly and appropriately, not only refusing to be provoked, but above all, stating again that we believe in arms control. We believe there must be a successor agreement to the New START treaty, and we're prepared to talk to the Russians about that even now, even during the conflict in Ukraine. A harder part for the US is what to do about the requirements for notifications. If Russia has ceased doing these routine notifications, should the US cease as well? And in particular, there is a big data dump that's done about twice a year that's coming up later this month. Should the US go ahead and provide that data to Russia, even though we don't expect the Russians to meet their obligation? My answer is yes. You always take the high road, particularly in a situation where you're competing not just for the hearts and minds of people in NATO allied countries, but in the entire global South, the countries that have taken a stance of neutrality between Russia and Ukraine need to see who is provoking, who is escalating, and who is trying to be consistent with treaty obligations. So this is the essential path that I hope the administration stays on, is to say as often as possible, as publicly as possible, we're ready to talk right now about how to reduce nuclear threats. It's going to be hard, as I said, because of the political environment in Washington. But what I would hope is that more people, and not just military leaders or political leaders, but every citizen in the country, ask the question, what world would provide greater national security for the United States? One in which Russia has 2,000 warheads, China has 2,000 warheads, and the US has 2 or 3 or 4,000 warheads, or alternately a world in which Russia and China and the United States each have 400 or 500 warheads, a sufficient number to guarantee a devastating response against any country stupid enough to launch a nuclear attack, but one that reduces the risk of accidental war, of a misconceived, limited nuclear war, or of any other circumstance. That's the message that I hope would, and if you agree as a government leader that the second scenario, with hundreds instead of thousands of nuclear weapons, better provides for our security, then let's announce that as a goal. And let's avoid taking steps that move us away from that goal. That's the recommendation that is not new with me. It was essentially articulated by some of the most famous Cold Warriors 15 years ago, Henry Kissinger, George Shultz, Bill Perry, Sam Nunn. And it remains the objective that we should be aiming at, even at a time when Russia is very recklessly brandishing its nuclear arsenal. As always, I want to remind people that arms control is not a tactic. It is not a weakness. It is not a gift that we give to an adversary. It is an essential building block of America's national security, and it contributes ideally to a more peaceful world. Let me stop there, and we can do questions in any of the many directions that I indicated. And John, you're going to run the Q&A, I think.
Well, I think we have a couple of questions from Marcia first, and then I've got some questions lined up from the audience.
I'll shoot a couple at you while I see a couple in the chat, but while other folks think about it. Thank you for that, for those remarks and making a really dense topic accessible to lay people. One of the things that's concerned me mightily is the extreme partisan dysfunction in the Congress and how it has absolutely crippled it to function, and how it's impacted almost every aspect of domestic and foreign policy. I'm curious how much of a factor it is in your work around nuclear security, and I'm assuming it is. And if that's the case, what could interested and concerned lay people like the folks on this call do about it?
Yeah, well, it's a
toughie.
Yeah, and there are many possible answers. First, it's not so much that the division in the Congress and the dysfunction, especially in the House of Representatives, has a direct effect on arms control negotiations as such. It will certainly have an effect if, in the next 3 years, the US and Russia are able to negotiate a new treaty and it is submitted to the Senate for ratification. The Senate under Mr. McConnell has proven itself to be a graveyard for treaties over the last 10 years. That's a problem. It's not an insurmountable problem because there is precedent going back to the great Cold Warrior Ronald Reagan, in which the US and the Soviets agreed to political agreements that fell short of a treaty, but that had the correct effect. There are a lot of things I worry about that the Congress is doing. I don't expect the House of Representatives to pass any serious legislation on any topic this year or next. But I do worry about some of the signals that are sent in the complex budget process. There's an irresistible urge on the part of both Republicans and Democrats to add to the defense budget things that the Defense Department doesn't even want. I mean, if the Pentagon doesn't want them and they're being forced to build or maintain certain weapons, it is very much a pork barrel program and a way to prove your testicular credentials. With so much money being spent on Ukraine, justifiably, in my view, it becomes a lot easier to slip in other things as well. And one in particular that I'm concerned about, the Trump administration looked at Russian nuclear doctrine, which implied, although the Russians deny it, that under certain circumstances, using a, quote, small nuclear weapon, when we say small, we mean only Hiroshima size, not the standard issue 300 kiloton that is 20 times as powerful as Hiroshima. Under certain circumstances, Russia could use this, and the US did not have a rapidly available small, quote unquote, nuclear warhead for response. Trump proposed 2 new delivery systems to address this so-called gap. Biden has rejected one, agrees to pursue the other. But the Congress is likely to continue to push to pursue both of them, which is unnecessary in a military sense, expensive and provocative. So those are the kind of things I worry about in the Congress. You're not going to get more positive statements from either the House or the Senate in the next couple of years about arms control, at least not in a majority vote. But there is a group called the, I got to double check. I think it's the Nuclear Policy Working Group. It's led by Senator Markey of Massachusetts and Senator Merkley of Oregon and Congressman Garamendi of California and Beyer of Virginia. And they at least talk about it, hold hearings, study, write letters to the administration. And the focus of their efforts right now is on reassuring the president that there is support for new arms control agreements. And so they ought to be encouraged as well. Everything else wrong that the Congress could do is, we only have an hour left. One of the things I worry about is on nuclear power. That, and this is a whole nother topic we could do, but to cover it briefly, because a nuclear power plant does not emit carbon or methane when it's operating, it is a potential partial solution to climate change. That's particularly true if you've already built the reactor and you keep it operating longer. If you're building a new reactor, there's a huge amount of carbon that goes into its construction, and that is emitted. There are brilliant scientists, really creative people working on new designs of nuclear reactors that offer the potential to have lower cost and more resistance to the risk of proliferation, more resistant in their design to the risk that somebody could divert the fuel for weapons purposes. At the same time, there's some very creative ideas that scare the hell out of me because they involve reprocessing. They like to call it recycling, but reprocessing is taking spent fuel, which has still a lot of potential energy in it, and processing it so that you can use the fuel again in a fast reactor. The problem with that is you cannot reprocess without creating plutonium, purified plutonium, which is basic to a nuclear weapon. And yet we have some folks enthusiastic in Congress for funding anything that is described as advanced reactor technology. Some of the ideas for advanced reactor technology are ideas that the US gave up on 50 years ago, but they're back and they are getting subsidized by the government. And just to leave you with one of the most delicious ironies of this, Bill Gates has a company called TerraPower, which started with a very good idea that of what it called a variable geometry reactor that could actually burn waste. You wouldn't have to purify waste, but by changing the configuration within a reactor, you could use up spent fuel. He switched gears, and TerraPower is now working on something that would require highly enriched uranium and reprocessing technology. And Bill Gates is confident it's going to work. And he's so confident that he got the US government to put up $2 billion to prove his concept. I don't know how much Bill lost in a divorce settlement that he doesn't have $2 billion of his own to prove what's going to work. Anyway, I've gone off on a rant and a tangent about nuclear reactors. We go back to nuclear weapons, if you like.
John, let's go to the chat box because we have no shortage of questions.
We do have a lot of questions, and the first question is someone you might be familiar with, Tom. It's one of our audience members named Peter Countryman.
Yeah, it sounds familiar. Yeah, you can put him.
And do you want me to read it, or would you like to read it yourself, Peter?
No, just unmute him and see if he can repeat it.
Oh, let's see if I can remember it. Well, I was just, when you mentioned that, having even 500 warheads should be enough for anybody to credibly deter an adversary, right? That's it occurred to me, yeah, that's true as long as you have a healthy ABM treaty. And I was just sort of, I was thinking there are other things besides the New START that probably lend a certain amount of stability to the environment. One is probably the ABM treaty, and I think the Open Skies Treaty. And I just wondered are those in any more doubt than they were a few years ago, or are those in good health as far as you know?
They're both dead.
No, that's not good. I think.
So to go back in history, the Nixon administration concluded with Brezhnev in 1972 the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. And it was a smart thing to do. One of the things about nuclear deterrence is you can't really stop 1,000 missiles coming your direction. There is no anti-missile magic weapon that will protect your own territory. And the search for such a weapon, which both the US and the Soviets were looking for in the 60s, Ronald Reagan revived in the 80s with his Star Wars initiative, and the idea has never gone away. But the more you focus on defending your homeland, the more incentive there is for the other side to build more and more weapons to overwhelm any potential missile shield. So by restricting the construction of anti-ballistic missile sites in both countries, it put a cap on the arms race itself, on the number of missiles each side felt it needed to have. And that was pretty important. The treaty was violated, or the US withdrew, if you prefer, from the treaty in 2002 under the Bush administration. And the argument was, well, first, we get along with the Russians now, so they won't care and they can't do anything about it because they're weak. Second, we do worry not just about Russian missiles, but about North Korean and maybe someday Iranian missiles. So we have to be free to build ballistic missile defenses on our own. We spend a huge amount of money building weapon systems that so far have shown limited reliability. They may or may not be able to stop a North Korean intercontinental ballistic missile. They certainly cannot stop several dozen Russian or Chinese ICBMs. And the Russians point for many years to the Bush withdrawal from the ABM treaty as the beginning of the decline of confidence in arms control between the two sides. It mattered more to the Russians than it did to us, but we simply ran over their objections and left the treaty. The Open Skies Treaty, remember, was an idea put forward by Eisenhower that we can have open flights over each other's territory according to certain regulations to give each other confidence that no one is preparing to invade another country. And it was finally negotiated under the Bush Senior administration. And it, in some ways, outlived its usefulness because there was a point in the last 20 years when, for the US at least, there was nothing you could gain from overflying a plane that you couldn't already see with a satellite. And so when the Russians did violations at the edges of the treaty, it was an easy excuse for the Trump administration to say, we're leaving the treaty, which it did in 2019, and the Russians left the next year, and it's gone. I think Trump was annoyed because one of the Russian flights over the US took pictures of his New Jersey golf course. It's sad because it wasn't of much technical value to the US, but it was still of great technical and confidence building value to our NATO allies, all of whom asked the US to stay, but we left anyway. So those two are gone. And that's what I refer to when I say that I expect that Putin had a hope that if he could cheat on a treaty, he could provoke the US into withdrawing from the treaty. It worked twice under the Trump administration. I don't think it will work now. Okay, who's next?
So the next question is from, and I don't know the first name, G. Zellen.
Yeah, I know him.
Okay.
George, go ahead.
Yeah. Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. So with the last, I think I saw this in the Atlantic, but the last nuclear test the United States did was in 1992, Russia roughly about the same time. And the bombs were built back then. How does anybody know how many of them still work?
Yeah. No, it's a great question. When the US and Russia agreed to stop testing, and then later all 5 of the major weapon states, China, Britain, France, agreed also to have a moratorium on nuclear testing, the US initiated something called the Stockpile Stewardship Program, which is a very big enterprise based in Los Alamos with one of the most powerful computers you'll ever see to assess whether the weapons in the stockpile are still safe. I know it's funny to think of a nuclear weapon as safe, but it's not going to blow up on its own.
Up accidentally.
And reliable. Will it work? And the degree of testing that they do is fascinating. It's both testing what are the properties of plutonium that is 50 years old. What are the properties of other metal components of the bomb that sit next to plutonium for 50 years? How do they change, and can they still be counted on? And part of the testing is what are called zero level or zero yield testing, which they still do in these deep holes in the ground in Nevada at the Nevada National Nuclear Security Site, in which they test components of the bomb, but not enough to produce a yield, an explosive yield. And that's what the 5 states are committed to. It's what the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty says is the standard. Still, there have been interesting articles recently that question, how can you be so sure if you actually haven't detonated one? And that it's a logical question, but as best science can answer, they're still in good shape. The Russians have something similar that I think is less sophisticated, so I can't answer for them.
And we also know for certain that mice aren't chewing through the insulation on the wires.
Yeah, they're pretty well secure. There have been enough classic screw ups in the storage, movement, management of nuclear weapons in the US over the years that we're very lucky none have gone off on US soil. But it's been a close call a number of times.
Okay.
Okay, well, our next question is from Tula, who has a question about Ukraine. And so would you like to ask this yourself, Tula, or would you? Okay, good.
Thank you for the conversation. I've never heard anybody address my question is if the Russians actually used a tactical nuke in Ukraine or bombed a nuclear power plant in Chernobyl or Zaporozhye, what type of response could we expect from that?
Great question. And I'm sure there are folks in the Pentagon and the State Department who have thought about it. First, there's the specific circumstances would matter a lot. If, for example, Russia were to detonate a dirty bomb, that is conventional explosive that spreads radioactive material and contaminates an area, that's one thing. And that's something that I'm concerned they would do. Why are you concerned? Because the Russians have made the accusation that the Ukrainians are going to do this. And whenever the Russians say, we think somebody else is about to do this, it means we're affixing to do that. So that's one scenario. Another is to cause a nuclear accident at Zaporizhzhia. And then the third is use of a device on the battlefield. All of them would be incredibly stupid things for Russia to do, but it's possible that in a war in which they've done 100 stupid things so far, that they will add this to the list. I think the most important thing is that the US and NATO not feel obliged to react instantly, rather to consider what are the options for a response. First, to contain the damage to civilians in Ukraine, and that would be especially important in case of a deliberate release of radiation from a dirty bomb or from the Zaporizhzhia reactor. But to take your time thinking about how to respond to Russia. If there were actual use of a nuclear device on the battlefield, I have pretty good confidence that the US and NATO would not respond with use of a nuclear device, but they may well take conventional action, either against the Russian base that launched the device, or go out and sink a Russian battleship before it sinks itself. There's a number of options that would be out there that would first not be immediate, would allow the world to absorb the horror of what Russia had done, and then respond in a way that causes Russia more loss than anything that they could have possibly have gained from that tactic.
So you think that hitting a sub or a ship for Russia would be equal to putting off a dirty bomb or using a tactical nuke in Ukraine, that we would consider that equal response?
Well, see, I don't think it has to be equal. And that is, where politics and emotions sometimes get in the way of making a rational military response. The point is not whether it's equivalent or it's like for like. It's rather, does it hurt the Russians more than anything that they gained from their use of that tactic?
And you feel that that would be something that would get the Russians' attention?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay.
Right. And our next question is from Jan about the Russian generals.
Sure.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm very curious about the meetings that you said you've had with the group of people, retired generals, et cetera, and that there are Russian retired generals who are not active in the government right now. How are they allowed to participate? And are they giving away any secrets?
The second question, no, they're not giving away any secrets. Second, Russia is a nasty place to live if you disagree with the government. Mm-hmm. But they're not punished for participating. On the other hand, we do these meetings on Zoom. Anybody can listen in on Zoom. The SVR, the successor to the KGB, can listen in and record. And so they have been very careful all the way through to avoid using the word war. It was a special military operation. It was a productive exercise in 2020 when we started doing this. And the Russians, Americans, and Europeans together drafted a set of recommendations for the new Biden administration on basic steps that could be taken to reduce tensions in Europe, and that we had some agreement on. But since the re-invasion of Ukraine in February of last year, as I said, they kind of spiraled into never, never land. It's hard for me to bite my tongue when I hear some of the outrageous things that are said, but they're not punished for it as long as they don't say anything that goes too far. The Russians, a couple of Russians I'm thinking about who said explicitly that Russia security will be damaged more than American security without New START. Those happen to be Russians who were not in Russia at the time, so they leaned a little further forward.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you. So we have O'Brien's there, and wonder O'Brien had a question about Ukraine as well. So I wonder if we could turn it over to him.
Okay.
Sure, thanks. So I'm on the political advocacy committee for the Ukrainian Association of Washington State.
Great.
And so my question is, how can NATO best deter Russia's potential use of a nuclear weapon or weapons? And one scenario in particular that I'm concerned about is, if the trajectory of the war continues as it is, and Ukraine is threatening to retake Crimea, that Russia would mimic the end of World War II and drop a bomb in Western Ukraine and say, you've got 72 hours to surrender, or we're going to do it again.
Yeah.
And, my concern is that, there are a lot of people in Russia who think that this would enable Russia to win the war, and with their nuclear might, and flip the script from a losing military war to winning. And my understanding in discussions with elected officials so far is that our response would be, I think, somewhat similar to what you described, would be a conventional response that would take at least 2 to 3 weeks to, get in place. And my concern, though, is that in Putin's view, that would not deter him from winning the war with use of nuclear weapons. So again, the question is just how can we best deter, if that is what Russia is potentially intending to do, how best can NATO deter that?
Yeah. No, it's a great question, and there's no simple answer. When I mentioned at the start that the risk of nuclear use in Ukraine is still there because nobody knows what a wounded, cornered animal will do. And the ultimate act of desperation would, I think, be triggered by the imminent loss of Crimea back to the legitimate Ukrainian government. So that is worth being concerned about. I don't think there's a single step you can do to deter it. You can continue to remind people that this is a threat, that Russian may do this. And that in itself is a deterrent. We think that the US release of intelligence about some of the particular things that the Russians had planned actually dissuaded the Russians from following through on those plans. So that's one step. The second is to get more of the world to say to Putin, this is unacceptable. There's been some success in this, a G20 statement saying that we can't use nuclear weapons, direct public statements from the Prime Minister of India, who otherwise has avoided criticizing Putin. Putin, to a degree, relies on his belief that, okay, NATO is against me, but they were always against me. But 100 countries in the world, even if they vote on a meaningless resolution in the United Nations General Assembly, they don't actually care what I'm doing, and they kind of have sympathy for me. For him to hear from more and more countries and leaders who otherwise have sustained relations with him that nuclear weapon use is unacceptable would have an effect. The fact that it would have no military beneficial effect and that the radiation would spread to Russia, not to the West,
Right,
should have an effect on him. But in the end, I can't exclude the scenario that you lay out, and don't have any better answers than those.
I guess, one thing I would ask then, and I made this maybe to the group too, if anyone does, I guess if I would just ask, not right now, but of course, if anyone does right now, but if anyone, that we all think about this, and if we do have any ideas, that we try to publicize them and share them, because I'm just concerned that Putin thinks he can escalate beyond what NATO is willing to escalate. And I guess one just quick idea that I think is kind of far-fetched, but it's the only one that I've been able to come up with, which is that we tell them that, look, we are going to allow Ukraine to use a NATO nuclear weapon and target it in Russia where they decide to, an equal amount to what Russia uses in Ukraine. And you tell them that up front. That's the only thing I see that would be equal in a response. And obviously it has implications, but I'm certainly open to other ideas if anyone has them.
Well, I understand your idea. I don't think it's achievable. I don't think you would get NATO consensus, and it would violate a number of treaties that the United States has signed. And again, equal or in-kind response is not necessarily the most effective response. I don't have a better one, but okay.
Thank you.
Thanks.
So our next question is from Chris and Anita Staley.
Oh, great. Great. Hi, Chris. Hi, Anita. Are they there? Yes. Hi, Dr. Chris.
And you're on mute.
There you go.
Okay. You're still muted, Chris. Ah,
Are we unmuted now?
yes.
Okay. So the question I have, if some of you may remember, back with some like a lot of fanfare back in 2018, Putin displayed this new delivery vehicle for nuclear weapons he was developing, and he targeted Miami in his display, and these invincible hypersonic missile delivery systems. And then you didn't hear any more about that. I mean, is Russia developing a different delivery system that's different than what we have? And was there truth to that?
Yes, there's truth to it. There's a lot of problems with it. Great to see you, by the way. So there's about 4 different things that Putin boasted about in 2018 and still likes to boast about. One is hypersonic missiles. And hypersonic are missiles that not only can fly faster than sound, after all, ballistic missiles do that, but a hypersonic missile doesn't fly as fast as an ICBM, but it can maneuver and can go at lower altitudes, less predictable paths, more difficult to intercept. US, China, Russia, India, and a couple of other countries are competing to build the sexiest hypersonic missiles right now. And they are intended specifically to avoid the kind of ballistic missile defense that the US, Russia, China, and others are also building. They're not necessarily a game changer. It's the US is building hypersonic missiles that it says will not carry nuclear warheads. China is designing hypersonic missiles that would carry nuclear warheads, and Russia is designing hypersonics that would have both. It tested one of these in an attack on Ukraine. It was the first firing in combat of the Kinzhal hypersonic missile. That's one category. It's not necessarily game-changing, but it is already actually deployed. The second category is heavy ICBMs. They are producing a new ICBM heavy launcher that is not unique. It could carry up to 10 warheads, when right now under the New START treaty, it would not be allowed to carry 10 separate, independently targetable warheads. But more importantly, it has a longer range. And again, this has to do with the Russian obsession with America's missile defense efforts, where the Russians really fear that those Americans, they may come up with some kind of technological breakthrough that really makes their missile defense shield effective. And so one of the things about the Sarmat is that it is got the range where instead of flying the short route from Russia to America over the North Pole, it could go over the South Pole and hit us from a side where we would have no ballistic missile defense. It's kind of crazy. I'm not so worried about the route it takes. I'm worried about the number of warheads it can hold. And that's why I say in the longer run, Russia has a greater warhead upload capability than the US does, is specifically because of that missile. And then Russia is working on 2 delivery systems that are not covered by the New START treaty. And presumably, if there's a successor treaty, we'd have to find a way to include them. One of them is just plain crazy. It is a nuclear-armed, nuclear-powered cruise missile. So an actual reactor in the cruise missile. It is an idea the US gave up on in 1962 because there's no way you can build a missile light enough to fly that has the shielding that prevents it from spewing radiation everywhere it flies. The Russians don't care about that. It is what I call the flying Chernobyl, because wherever it flies, it will spread radiation. But it's not covered by New START. It could circle the Earth many times theoretically before hitting its target, be very hard to shoot down. They have not yet successfully tested it. They've had some unsuccessful tests of this. And the last one is maybe not quite as crazy, still pretty scary, is a nuclear-powered torpedo that could circle the Earth's oceans many times before delivering a large payload into a US port and destroying that port and contaminating the region. And that's not covered by any arms control treaties. It should be in the future. It's not a very brilliant weapon, but it's something that Mr. Putin loves. So those are tasks for the future.
Okay, so we'll get back to regular questions in a second, but I just wanted to, there's, out of all the scary things we've talked about, there's one we haven't got to yet. And one of the areas where it could really likely have a nuclear war exchange happen would be between India and Pakistan. And I was wondering if there's anything the US can do to help reduce the prospect of that happening.
Yeah. No, it's a great question. Yeah, you should worry about it. Definitely. If you had asked me about 2 years ago, and in fact, I said this in congressional testimony more than once, that I considered the probability of a nuclear war between India and Pakistan to be higher than the probability of a nuclear war between the US and Russia. Not a high probability, but if you're thinking about where it could most easily happen, I would have said South Asia. Today, I'm not quite as sure. Pakistan and India are difficult issues, and both difficult countries to deal with. What the US has tried to do with both countries since 1998 is first to talk to them about nuclear security. And nuclear security in that specialized meaning was a big priority of the Obama administration. It means, are your weapons locked down? Is your highly enriched uranium and plutonium locked down so that no terrorists can get hold of a bomb or the materials for a bomb? And it's something that you worry about in places like Pakistan, where there are terrorist groups operating, some of them more or less freely or with government tolerance. And so we worked with both India and Pakistan to make sure that they took this seriously. And I think that Pakistan definitely demonstrated to me they take it very seriously. India, the last time I looked several years ago, I was a little bit less reassured. But that's step one, security of weapons and of fissile material. The second step is to try to get them to talk to each other. And here there was always a greater Pakistani desire to talk than there was an Indian desire. It was quite frustrating to me because I found the Indian attitude towards Pakistan to be so condescending as to preclude the possibility of meaningful conversations between them. You could talk to the Indians and say, well, this is what the Pakistanis are saying. And they would just say, well, they don't know what they're talking about. And it's no use talking to them. That needs to, we need to keep trying. It's difficult. And it's difficult because there's, real nationalism on both sides. In, I think it was 2019 or 18 that they had this border incident. And it was the first time in history that two states with nuclear weapons were flying combat missions over each other's territory, and with fatalities on both sides, and with a press and a social media that was urging both governments to use nuclear to teach the other guy a lesson. It was very scary, and it could happen again. Should we do more? Yes. I think the administration is trying to do more, but there's no shortcut on that one.
All right. Well, thank you. Our next question is from Hans. Hans, are you still there? Yes, there you are.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. Thanks. And since I wrote the question and listening to your responses, Mr. Countryman, and I'm really glad you're here, and you're a very reasonable person. And your last comment about that Indians have nothing but contempt for Pakistanis is kind of interesting. It'll take me, and if I forget, remind me at the end of this. But my question was, many Americans are concerned about democratic government, right? I mean, we heard, if you look on the planet, if the United States falls, the game is over, or so it seems. I mean, I don't see the British Empire resurrecting itself. The French can do what they want to do. I don't see anybody else picking up the torch and saying democracy is the way to go. So how do we protect that? And what I have noticed, and maybe I read too many paranoid books, but like the 100-year marathon, the role of the Confucius Institute, and this is where I have to disagree with you a little bit, and a lot of time is being spent on, how do we get the best nuclear weapon, when I think really what's going on is China. We all want to stop Ukraine. Everybody wants to stop Ukraine. But China is our real concern, not Ukraine, and not even Russia. Russia is a concern for the Europeans and always has been. And it's interesting that you see the old alliances, right? I mean, you either saw it was the Russians and the French against the Germans, or it was the French and the Russians, the French and the Germans against.
Hans. Okay.
Yes.
Can I just ask you to
I'll
frame it as a question? This might be
okay,
a lot for him to handle in one question. So.
Okay. No, you're right. So yeah. The end of it is, one, are we missing the real picture? Are the Chinese using the Russians to deplete the United States' ability and NATO and everything else if it comes to a confrontation with them and so on. That's number one. And number two, the Chinese are not that concerned about using weapons of mass destruction because they have a different agenda. Should we be limiting Chinese involvement in the United States, commercial involvement? Should we actually be passing legislation that restricts their ability to buy agricultural lands, to buy into 51% of American companies, you can buy 49% if you want.
Yeah.
Is that what we should do?
Okay, got it. All right, there's a lot there. So comparing the threat posed by Russia and that posed by China. First, there's no question that China is a rising power, rapidly growing economy that one day may be bigger than the United States, and a rapidly expanding military, although they spend a fraction of the US Pentagon budget on their military. Russia is not going to get stronger, but it still has nuclear weapons, and that's why we have to take it seriously. The issue with Ukraine is not that Russia is a greater threat to the US homeland than China. It's that the most basic foundation of the post-World War II global order has been violated. That most basic foundation is wars of conquest against your neighbor's territory are no longer acceptable. That's the essence of the UN Charter of the Helsinki Final Act. It's what Saddam violated in Kuwait. And it is potentially more dangerous and more destabilizing than any other violation of international law, and more than any civil war that we have seen in the last 78 years. Now, not everybody in the global South agrees with that, and there are plenty of Africans and Asians who believe that's the Europeans back to their old habit of fighting with each other. It's a lot more than that, and that's why it's important to focus on Ukraine and to give Ukraine all possible aid to achieve a victory in that conflict. Now, China is different. There is no question that China is, as the Pentagon calls it, the pacing threat for the future. They wish to compete with the United States. They have a nearly religious belief that it is inevitable that China will replace the United States as the world's leading power. And they act in support of that messianic belief. On the other hand, they have not done something as irresponsible as open military invasion of a neighbor for the purpose of conquering territory. They do not pose a threat to the US homeland. Nobody poses a threat to the US homeland. They do perceive there are no Chinese military forces in the waters off the United States. There are substantial US military forces on the waters around China. This is not to say that's a bad idea for us to support allies who have good reason to fear Chinese expansionism. But there is a certain degree of hysteria in Washington in which anybody in the government or in the Congress who says, yes, I'm worried about China, but we still need to work with them on climate change, on nuclear arms control, on reducing tensions. Anybody who says that gets the McCarthyist response of, you are soft on Chinese communism. And I really am worried about how much we are spinning ourselves up into a rhetorical arms race with China that will become not just a nuclear arms race, but open conflict. Now, how to respond to the many ways that China violates other rules of the international order with industrial espionage, currency manipulation, subverting democratic practices. We need to work against all of those, but we need to do it in a smart manner and not destroy the systems that we are seeking to preserve. Keep in mind that one of the things that historically people have thought would prevent war is the economic interconnectedness of countries. Now, many people believed in 1914 that there could not be a war in Europe because all the businesses and industry and trade were too interconnected, but we got a war anyway. On the other hand, a lot of good people think that what has prevented India and Pakistan from escalating to all-out war in their last few border crises has been the fact that it would devastate their export-dependent economy, especially on the Indian side. So I don't think that the answer is to destroy all economic ties between the US and China. There are reasons for destroying as many US-Russian economic ties at the moment as possible, but I don't think that's the answer for China.
Thank you.
Tom, thank you
Okay.
very much for your comments tonight. I'm afraid we've let the time get away from us, and it is the witching hour, and you probably need a nightcap and to go to bed. So thank you so much for doing an evening program. Thank you for your really cogent remarks.
And having my nightcap all the way through.
Oh, good boy, good boy. I feel a lot smarter and a lot more depressed than when I started this call.
All right.
But thank you all. We hope we'll see you.
Remember Mother Jones, don't mourn, organize.
I love that. I love that. So thank you. And I hope that we'll see you at another World Affairs Council program in the future. Really appreciate you joining us tonight.
Thank you, everyone. Hope to see you in person later this year.